If there is one concept that you really can benefit from in JavaScript, here it is: functions. Okay, functions. We love functions in JavaScript. And because functions in JavaScript are both so flexible and so useful and so widely used just all the time, they're a fundamental piece of the language. You benefit a lot from having a solid understanding of functions in JavaScript, and there are some really important principles behind how do functions in JavaScript behave? How do they work? Okay, that's what I want to talk about today. So, welcome back to Fundamental Principles of JavaScript with your host, myself, Marek. And today, here's the topic for the day: 2 principles of functions in JavaScript. So I really wanted to distill it. If you were to ask me the question, what are the 2 most important things to know about functions? These are the 2 things. Now, what I will say is that these are 2, let's say, unique attributes that functions have in JavaScript they're not the case for all programming languages. Many programming languages actually don't have this kind of flavor of function that JavaScript has. So, in fact, these 2 principles, you might say that these are ways in which JavaScript functions are special and not like other programming languages. So this is a useful thing to think about, right? Comparatively to other languages, what is special about JavaScript? And it's a useful type of knowledge to have. One, because if you are using other programming languages, whether you're coming to JavaScript from a different language, that's one possibility, or if you are planning to learn some other languages, then it's important to keep that in mind. How are certain features of the language different between languages? Sure, but also even without that, even if you're not focusing on any other languages right now, I think this is really good to know. It's good to know, okay, in the wider theoretical world of programming, how are these concepts in JavaScript different from elsewhere? It's actually just helpful for your understanding to be aware of that. Let's just jump right into it, and we're going to start with principle number 1. In JavaScript, functions are first-class values. They're first-class values. In other words, what does this really mean? It means that they are values like any other. Like any other value in JavaScript, functions can do all the same things and they behave in all the same ways as other values. But let's back up for a second. What does that mean? What is a value? What is a value in JavaScript? Well, all that means, all that the word value means is the kinds of things that you manipulate. So, we're talking about strings, we're talking about numbers. These are the basics, the basic values. We also have, booleans, and I'll put a quick mention of other types of sort of constant-like values like null and undefined. But maybe more interestingly, we have arrays, and we have objects. And in this list, yeah, you guessed it, we also have functions. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about values. And the fact that functions are in this list, this is really interesting. Think about that. It means that functions can behave and can be manipulated in the same ways that you might manipulate strings, numbers. They also behave similar to other kinds of more complex structures like arrays or objects. So there's no real limit. There's nothing special about functions that limit what you can do with them. And in other languages, often functions actually have limitations. So in a lot of programming languages, you can't manipulate functions in the same ways that you can these other types of values. And that's why we call them first-class values, because there is no sort of class hierarchy. There's no class system in JavaScript where some values are more powerful than others. That's what that means. This doesn't refer to classes as in the object-oriented construct. It actually has nothing to do with object-oriented in this context. We're really talking about, well, imagine that. Imagine if different values in the language, had different positions in a class system. If we had different classes like we have classes in a society, well, if you imagine that that's how it worked, well, then you would know now that JavaScript doesn't have different classes. Everyone is a first-class citizen of the language. But we don't have the full story yet, because so what? So what if functions are first-class values? Well, that raises this question. What can you actually do with values? Right? What can you do? What's the special thing that makes this interesting? There's a number of things you can do with values. Now, you got to bear with me because some of this might be obvious. Well, it's obvious. You can assign. You can assign a value, and I mean assign to a variable. You can assign to variables. Okay, so that's a good start. Yeah, you can assign values to variables, which means that you can do this with functions. Great, you have a function. You can assign it to a variable. You can then reassign it to another variable. So far, so good. That's good to know that you have that ability. What else? Well, you can put values into arrays. So you can take any value and you can make it a member of an array. So right away now, we've already learned that you can do that with functions too, because they're first-class values. So you can put a function into an array. You can have an array that's just a bunch of functions in it. Now, we're not going to get into in what cases is that useful, but there could be a whole variety of situations where that could be useful, hypothetically, absolutely. So it's great to have that flexibility that if you ever need an array of functions, you can have it. And you can also put values into objects. Also very interesting. Also very interesting that you can put functions into objects. In other words, functions can be members of objects. And that's definitely very flexible. Objects, you could say that aside from functions, objects are the other really flexible and useful construct that we use in JavaScript, that we use all over the place. So they make a great combination. Well, what else? There's more. You can pass values into function calls. Okay, so I'm talking about passing arguments. Passing values as arguments into function calls. You're calling a function, and let me just clarify what I mean here. Let's say I have a function that I'm calling. Well, here's my value, right? I can put a value here, and this is the argument that I'm passing into the function. So that can be a function itself. In fact, it's like I have two functions in this expression. I have the function that I'm calling, and then I have another function that I'm passing as an argument into the function. Now, you might recognize this pattern as actually the basis for what we call callbacks. Callback functions are just functions that we pass into another function with the expectation then that then the function is going to be called after it's been received inside of that function. So the whole mechanism of callbacks, which is a big part of a topic we won't get into in this video, but it's a big part of asynchronous programming, this idea of callbacks. Well, that's what it's built on, this simple idea that because functions in JavaScript are values, that means you can pass them into a function call, and that's it. That's why that's possible, and that's why that's such a powerful feature. It doesn't end there. You can also return values from function calls. Anywhere where you have a return statement, right, inside of a function, what comes after a return statement? Well, it could be whatever you want, and it could be a function value as well. Now that's cool because that means you can have a function that returns functions. And this is a pattern that could be useful where you actually use a function to create new functions and then return them. So let me just say that opens up a lot of possible programming patterns, a lot of interesting, very flexible possibilities. The fact that you can return functions from function calls. A very, very interesting feature. And finally, you can throw. Now, maybe you see this less often. The idea that you can throw things that aren't just errors. I mean, if you're familiar with the whole, exception handling mechanisms of JavaScript, there's the idea that you throw errors using the throw keyword. And you can throw error objects. That's a common use case, but you can also throw any value. And sometimes people don't always realize that. You can actually throw anything. You can throw any value, and therefore you can throw functions too. Now, this is probably from this list, this is probably the feature that I've seen used most rarely. To throw a function, I don't know exactly actually what use cases there are for that, but it's interesting to know that that's possible, that the language does allow that. So, yeah, that's very cool. That's very cool that, it's just interesting to see that JavaScript is a very flexible language, that it allows all of these things. And I think that's part of what makes it powerful, is that the language designers, they give you all this freedom. They gave you all these flexible ways of using it. And it's up to the programmers to then figure out ways to make this useful, maybe interesting programming patterns that take advantage of these features. I think that's a great way that the designers of JavaScript basically gave us, the users of the language, a lot of trust, saying, hey, play around with these features, see what you come up with. There are few limits. Basically, they put few limits in place to limit what we could do with functions in JavaScript. All right, great. So that's this principle that we call, first-class values. Now, there's another principle I want to cover. Principle number 2. JavaScript functions are closures. Okay, so if you haven't seen this word before, it's actually a phrase that comes from computer science, the idea of a closure. And this is another thing, actually, that is not the case for all programming languages. Many programming languages, and maybe even most, I don't know, do not have the concept of a closure. But JavaScript does, and all functions in JavaScript are closures. So what does that mean? Closures have to do with what variables, what values does a function have access to. Let's look at kind of a little example here. We're going to consider the body of a function. Now, I created a function here called hello, and it doesn't actually have anything in the body here, but I just want to illustrate, suppose we were here in the body of the function where I drew the x. What variables do I have access to from outside of the body? Well, there's one obvious one that we can see right away. We have access to a parameter like name. So any parameters, or in other words, any arguments that you pass into the function, well, it's obvious. They are made available for you to use inside the function's body. And that's where the story ends if we don't have the idea of a closure. But the idea of a closure is that a function in JavaScript has access to its parameters, and also it has access to its outside environment. It has access to the variables defined in the scope outside of the function. And that means, well, suppose I have this variable defined just outside of the function. Because our functions are closures, they have access to these kinds of variables. So that means inside of my function, I can access this variable called city. And that's great because like I said, in many programming languages, you can't do that. Yeah, you actually cannot access something outside of the function because of limitations of how the language is designed. In fact, in many languages, it just didn't seem like a useful thing to be able to access variables outside. And you might make arguments, why would you say we don't want that? Why would you say we don't want to be able to access variables outside of the function? It makes things simpler. That's one reason. It makes the implementation of the language, the engine, whether it's the interpreter like in JavaScript or an actual full compiler, Things are a lot simpler if you can have the assumption that functions can only access variables that are inside of the function. But JavaScript, well, it was decided, let's go and implement this feature. It's worth it. And it's true, because there are a lot of things that are possible with JavaScript are possible because functions are closures and they have this ability. Now, the word closure, if you ask me, when I first heard this, I thought, what is that? What does that mean? A closure? It doesn't seem to be something that I've heard before. And I'm not sure actually why computer scientists called this feature a closure, but it's like if you imagine that the function has boundaries outside of it. It's like it's closed outside of the actual function body itself. It's this environment that it has outside of itself. I don't know. I think that's the closest that I can come to an explanation for why it's called a closure. It's like it encloses more than just the function body itself. So that's what a closure is. And when you combine this with other features of JavaScript functions, and I'm talking about the fact that they are first-class values, that becomes really interesting. Because suppose that just below this example, we were to use one of these abilities that functions have. So what did I just talk about in terms of the things you can do with a function? Well, let's take one example. You can pass it into a function call. So my function hello that I just defined, what if right after I defined it, I'm just going to use an example, I'm going to call set timeout, and I can pass the function into that function call. And then, set timeout takes a delay of milliseconds, so we'll do that, we'll give it a delay. So I've just called my function hello, and I've put it into this I've passed hello as an argument into set timeout. So the reason why I'm doing this is I want to illustrate the closure here. We're actually passing this function with its environment into set timeout. In other words, it kind of packs its environment as its own baggage, and it travels around with it. That means no matter where function hello is called, it's going to have access to city. So even when we pass it in here, and then after it's passed into set timeout, it goes into somewhere deep in the event loop. This is how I like to draw the event loop. So it goes somewhere, we don't even know, we don't really see where it ends up. But eventually it gets called by the event loop after a delay happens. And that's the magic of the closure. Even though the function has now left the location in the code where it has access to the variable city, it still has access to it. It still remembers that this is its environment, and it packed up that environment, and it took that environment with it. And so that's actually the power of a closure. It's not just that functions have the ability to access variables that are in the environment, but beyond that, it's the fact that you can then use the function, pass it around, send it to another function, assign it to different variables, return it from a function, put it in an array, put it in an object. All this stuff can happen, and it's always going to keep that environment with it. So now that explains the power of functions in JavaScript.